everyone, for joining us for this final session of the day. It's my pleasure to introduce Philip Lockwood. He is the head of the Innovation Unit in the Emerging Security Challenges Division at NATO. And Philip led the establishment of DIANA, which is NATO's new transatlantic innovation agency, and also the NATO Innovation Fund, which we'll be discussing. Philip also leads the team responsible for NATO's strategies around emerging and disruptive technologies. So I'll just give you a very brief overview of the NATO Innovation Fund. It was set up in June 2022, so we're coming up to a year now, almost exactly. And it's the world's first multi-sovereign venture capital fund. And it's €1 billion fund, and it invests in early-stage startups and other VC funds. And the technologies it seeks to invest in include artificial intelligence, big data processing, quantum technologies, autonomy, biotechnology, energy, propulsion, and space, among others. And these technologies are to be used in military and defense applications. So Philip, could you first of all just tell us a bit about why this fund was set up?
Sure, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here again. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak. Thanks very much to Jim and the team at GCV. We're incredibly excited about the fund because despite what our press releases have said from time to time, the fund didn't actually launch in 2021 in Brussels at the summit. That was the decision by heads of state to say, hey, NATO, you should think about creating this venture capital fund. And it wasn't last year when we had heads of state sign up to the LPA. It's actually going to be in about 2 weeks at the summit in Vilnius when we announce the launch of the fund with all of its regulatory licenses in place, with the team that's going to be managing the investments in place. And so we're really excited to be able to do that. It's been a crazy last couple of years. And a massive initiative and a first very much for NATO, and also I think one for Europe. The fund is really a response to, I think, a number of different issues that we've seen in the market. And that includes the fact that if you look at the deep tech investment ecosystem in Europe, outside of perhaps the corporate venturing realm, this has been a dead zone and a dead space for many, many, many years. And so we are looking to be able to leverage the brand name of NATO and a very large venture capital fund completely dedicated to deep tech with a bias towards hardware and a bias towards patient capital for solving really significant problems and challenges, not just pure defense ones, but ones that are more societal in nature. So we're trying to be able to crowd in Canada and to have a fund that's willing to lead, that's willing to co-invest, and that's willing to invest in other deep tech funds to help address the problems that we see in Europe. We're also trying to be able to bridge a gap between the innovation ecosystem that we see across the alliance that's really driven by startups and spinouts from universities, in which private sector capital plays a really critical role, and the world of defense and security. Because back in the day, things like the internet or GPS or the Saturn V rocket actually were created from defense initiatives. But in these days, since roughly the mid-90s, that government spend, particularly in terms of defense for new R&D and new innovation, has very much dropped off compared to private sector innovation and the spend of all the corporates. I think I was listening earlier today to Eileen talk about how we've gone from 10 corporate VC funds in the early 2000s to now somewhere around, I think it's 2000-ish today. That's a tremendous amount of spend in really critical technology, I think, in general, that we see. So if defense and security is no longer actually the primary financier of innovation across the alliance, then it means that we don't have an eye on what's actually going on. It means that we're not often considered the end customer for a lot of this amazing technology. And so there's a natural gap and divide that's really emerged. And so we want to be able to leverage this fund and to leverage DIANA as well, our innovation agency, with a startup accelerator to help bridge the gap, to understand how private sector ecosystems work and function, and to be able to learn how to change and evolve our systems to work more closely with them.
Right. And how many members of NATO are participating in the fund?
Yeah, so NATO is now an alliance of 31 nations, and hopefully we'll see that number increase very shortly. And often we do things with all 31 nations. And so DIANA, this innovation agency, is transatlantic in nature. Currently, we have 23 of the nations signed up for the fund. And NATO also does a fair amount of multinational initiatives, things like AWACS, work on things like the Eurofighter were originally started through initiatives at NATO. And we tend to do that where we have initiatives of higher risk, and I think something like venture capital fits into that bucket.
And so you haven't invested in any startups yet, because is that correct?
No,
Just
so
getting started.
yeah, exactly. So we're waiting like the very final green light right now from the Luxembourg regulator. The fund is set up as a separate entity outside of NATO. So there's various different models. I'm sure you all know in the corporate venturing space. This is set up as an individual separate fund. It's a Luxembourg partnership with the 23 investing nations as LPs, and a bespoke general partner entity set up by NATO specifically just to manage this fund and to do so under private sector norms. And so we should have our licensing in place before the summit. We'll have the team announced then, and I think you'll see first investments probably this fall.
So could you give us an idea of what startups you're interested in getting going
Sure.
in the beginning?
I think, so just a couple things in terms of investment thesis. This is a deep tech fund. So we're really looking at cutting edge technologies. We gave there was a bucket list that Kim talked about early on. So there's lots of technologies and areas of interest. I think one thing when people think about NATO is they think about the world of defense, and they think about, okay, this is defense tech. We're not looking to invest in new types of munitions. I don't think that you would categorize the vast majority of the investments this fund would make as being really defense investments, maybe dual use. But I also think that we think about this as a defense and security fund, and really an emphasis on defense and security in 2023 is very different from defense and security in the Cold War. When we're dealing with things like global pandemics, there's a role for defense in terms of response to that and various elements of crises like the wildfires that we're seeing across the alliance today. I think we can think about energy transition and what we've seen over the last year with the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, and how energy security has actually been almost weaponized by adversaries. So that means that we need to actually be embracing new elements of transition and getting away from traditional mechanisms of energy. Things like resilience, for example, resilience of our underwater, undersea infrastructure, that's an area of interest. And so the technologies that might be responding to those problems are not quite what you would generally think of as pure defense-related technology. So it's quite broad. I think early on, you'll see the fund do a fair amount of investments in the energy space. You might see the world of autonomy coming into play. Obviously, in the Ukrainian conflict, we've seen drones put to use in various ways and mechanisms. But I also think that we can think about the world of quantum, for example, in terms of sensing or communications as being really interesting areas. And so we're interested in that. And then maybe, I think, novel materials, looking at the semiconductor space or various aspects there could be quite keen. If I could hazard something, I'd love to see the fund actually invest in fusion and take a bet on something that's not just 2 or 3 years away from adoption, but something that could be 10, 15, or 20 years, just to be able to show that we're willing to take significant bets on things as well. And maybe if I could say one other piece, the fund does have a slight fund-of-funds strategy. I don't think a significant amount of the capital, in terms of 50%, is going to go towards fund-of-funds, but we are looking to actively invest in some strategic partners, particularly deep tech-related funds, and some of them will be emerging brand new fund managers in different areas of the alliance, especially maybe undercapitalized regions like in the south or the east. And then I think we're looking for some strategic partners on more established managers as well.
And could you just talk a bit about what kind of corporate partnerships you're interested in?
Sure. I think, as I've mentioned before, corporates play a really critical role, and particularly in the deep tech space and in the hardware space, that's an area where corporate VCs have historically paid a lot more attention to. But I think of corporates playing a really key role for this fund in maybe 3 ways. The first is both for the NATO Innovation Fund, but also our startup accelerator, DIANA. We're looking to partner with corporate entities because so much of the work in defense and security requires larger established corporate players to partner with government for various initiatives. And so I think that these corporate partners that are already working on government contracts in some way or another, they may have critical needs that startups could solve. And so I think providing demand signals themselves to the NATO Innovation Fund could be really, really helpful, and also to our accelerator. I think the second is in terms of co-investment in a lot of these areas of technology. Whether you're an energy corporate, or whether you're a defense prime, or whether you're working on something completely unrelated, I think the aperture is wider than you might think. And then the last aspect is in terms of the portfolio companies that we have. Again, we're going to be looking to try and connect them with multinational programs for governments to be able to adopt these technologies. But through some of our new authorities that we've created for Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund, we're actually looking to be able to create new mechanisms for private companies to partner with governments on not only sponsoring development of these initiatives, but also to be able to procure, and in some ways in some financial and potentially tax advantageous mechanisms. And so I think there's a role for corporates also to potentially co-invest alongside the fund, and then work with ministries of defense or other ministries to actually adopt these technologies in ways that could be helpful and beneficial to the corporate partners too.
I wanted to open up to the floor also if anyone's got any questions. While you're thinking about possible questions, I was just wondering if you, if there's perhaps maybe reluctance on the part of corporates to get involved in a NATO fund, just given the sort of connotations there with defense.
Yeah, I think it's actually been really quite interesting to see when we were coming up for the concept of the fund, which was in kind of late 2020 and early 2021 or so. We actually had a number of corporate VCs that were involved in red teaming this concept from quite a wide variety, different types of OEMs, and I was surprised at some of the industries that they were coming from in terms of their interest in partnering with us. So I recognize that, look, in an ESG-related world, there's going to be question marks about defense and whether this is something that can be a partner. And I think my response to that is, first of all, the fund is set up actually as an ESG fund. So it's a light green fund, Article 8 of the SFDR. So there's a bias towards investing in green technologies and solving climate-related issues. There's also a social aspect to this that we're trying to lean on. And I think that given what we've seen over the last year with the war in Ukraine, defense is changing from being the taboo that it might have been once upon a time. And I think that if we look at investors, particularly across Europe, there's technologies that could be used for offensive purposes in defense. And quite frankly, I think that's going to be a very small amount, if any, of the investment that we're looking at. And then we're looking at defense that could be for information collection, or looking at information management and systems, things like intelligence or surveillance-related aspects, decision-making, logistics, and then you can get to more security, things like food security and energy security, et cetera. And so I think there's really actually a broader discussion that we need to have, and this is something that we talked about yesterday in the Global Defense Council, that I think we'll start to see more of an initiative and a discussion. So all I would say is, if you have concerns about what it means to invest alongside NATO, because that automatically means defense, you do have us wrong. And I think we'll surprise you in terms of the areas that we will be looking to invest and the way that we're actually trying to rewrite the script. The fund comes out of something called NATO 2030. The SecGen is trying to change the alliance and to bring it into the year 2030 and beyond. But we're not trying to have NATO that is a NATO for the Cold War. And I think the world that we live in is more than just armed conflict. It actually needs to be much more broad in terms of security and how we're helping really preserve the future for the 1 billion citizens that live in the alliance.
We have some questions.
Thank you for the insight, Philip. Very direct question. Putting NATO at the front, does that help or hinder in either your fundraising from member states potentially, or obviously sourcing companies to invest in?
So I think in terms of the fundraising, it wasn't particularly difficult, but then a lot of our funds are coming from ministries of defense. But about half the LPs have investments coming from finance ministries, treasury ministries, innovation ministries. And I think before and after the war and the invasion of Ukraine, we would be having slightly different conversations. I think then when it comes to startups, the reason why we're doing it through NATO is because I think individually a defense market isn't necessarily all that attractive for most of the allied nations, except for maybe the United States. But if you suddenly say, hey, actually, you've got a market of 23 allied nations, just to put into context, I think that's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 700 billion per year in defense-related spending. That's a fairly significant market. I don't think there are that many startup founders that would actively say no without exploring the potential of that type of market opportunity.
Okay. Yeah, Philip, that's really fantastic. It's a really exciting project that you're working on. I'm just wondering, as you're thinking about sourcing the deals, obviously you're just about to announce the management team, but then with the accelerator project as well, how much do you think you might be able to rely on some of the work that, say, the British Patient Capital or, say, the EIC, and we've heard from Catherine and Stefan over the past day or so, just to be able to say, well, actually, they're sourcing a lot of this stuff. You know, maybe it's just being able to cherry pick, because obviously it's not just defense as we would perhaps understand it otherwise.
Totally. I think, I mean, I know the leadership of both British Patient Capital and the EIC. Some of the folks on my team who helped us design the fund and negotiate it are on the board for the EIC, and so we intend to work very closely with them. I think, again, coming from a panel discussion earlier today, especially given the economic downturn that we're currently facing, I think there's a really critical role for government capital in this space. And I think that, generally speaking, we're going to be pretty closely aligned with one another and actively looking for opportunities. So far the conversations have been very strong. I expect that to continue.
Yeah, I was wondering, what assurances would startups have that their technologies will be used in a morally responsible way by NATO member governments? I mean, you've mentioned stuff like big data, surveillance, cybersecurity. Like, what is the kind of the assurance they have that it will be used against, say, unfriendly powers and not, to give an example, environmental organizations or protesters in their own countries?
Sure. I think that's part of looking at NATO 2030 and our work in the world of, we call them EDTs, Emerging Disruptive Technologies. So my unit is also responsible for NATO's strategy in that regard. So a couple of years ago, allies agreed that we're trying to foster innovation. We're trying to protect ourselves from these technologies used against us. We're trying to protect these technologies when we're in a technology race. But over all of that, as an overarching goal, is what we call responsible use. And so there's a commitment to making sure that our democratic values and principles actually are applied in not only the use of these technologies, but also the development of these technologies. Whether it means looking at the environmental impact of developing these technologies. If you look at LLMs and generative AI, that's a tremendous amount of energy that's being expended as they're being developed. We're concerned about that because of the impact that has in the environment. So when my team wrote NATO's AI strategy and our autonomy strategy, we actually developed a set of principles of responsible use. You can look them up on the NATO website, but they include things like lawfulness, explainability, traceability, accountability, these sorts of things that all nations have agreed to. And as we have more strategies for biotech later this year and quantum, we'll be promulgating more rules of of responsible use. And we actually have a special board that we're setting up at NATO. Currently, it's for data and AI and autonomy, called the Data and AI Review Board, where we bring in ethicists, we bring in lawyers, we bring in professors from academic institutions, operators, commanders, and we bring them together to actually look at how do we take these principles and operationalize them and make sure that we have standards to certify that we're behaving in a way that is in accordance with our law, international law, and our values.
There's a gentleman here who's like to ask a question.
Thank you. Are you in competition or complementary to In-Q-Tel, or if a company is in a similar space, can they approach both at the same time, or is that a challenge for your NATO fund?
Sure. Yeah, I think In-Q-Tel has been helping us to red team this concept for a long time, so I don't think we're in competition with them. Generally complementary spaces, about half of In-Q-Tel's investment is into the deep tech space, so those are the investments. In-Q-Tel has been expanding its European operations, starting with the UK and now moving outwards as well. I think they're getting ready for an office in the continent too. In-Q-Tel is very different from the fund in the sense that it writes very small checks. And particularly its check sizes overseas are very limited. For the Innovation Fund, we can lead rounds, and we expect to generally lead rounds. And we can write very significant, sizable checks that are appropriate for the world of deep tech, both from a Series A and in terms of follow-on investing as well. It's a 15-year fund, so at €1 billion, we're in it for the long haul.
Well, I've been told to kind of wrap it up. Philip, thank you very much for telling us more about the fund and how it works, and good luck with that. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Cheers.